As we've talked about before, users can either be signed in or signed out in FriendlyChat. Moments ago, we just set up what happens when they're signed out. Firebase UI will display a sign-in flow for them. Now when they're signed in, we need to do a few things. We need to set up and display a message list, and we also need to make it possible so that when they type in a nice friendly message, their username will appear next to it. In this way, it'll actually be clear who's talking. When signed out, we need to do the opposite and tear down the message screen. Once the message screen has been torn down, we'll send them back to the sign-in screen like we're already doing. Let's add a little bit more code to our auth state listener to deal with these UI changes. Okay, so here's my handy dandy auth state listener, and I'm actually going to add two helper methods. The first one will be in place of the toast, and it's going to be called on signed in initialize. And the second I'll call here, and I'm going to call it on signed out cleanup. Now for on signed in initialize, I'm going to pass in the username, and I could get the username by taking the Firebase user object that I have and calling getDisplayName. I'm going to now scroll down to the bottom of our class and actually create those two methods. In onSignedInInitialize, I'm going to go ahead and set the username, and I could do that by taking my username member variable and setting it to the username that I just passed in. Now, what does setting this username variable do? Well, if I scroll up here to where I'm performing the database writes, you'll see that when I make the friendly message object for my new message, that I am including a username, mUsername. So once mUsername is set, any message that is sent will have that username. Okay, let's scroll back down to the bottom. Now beyond setting the username here, this is a great place to attach a read listener. You might have noticed that reading isn't quite working, and that's due to where I attached the read listener. So let's scroll up and see where that is now. Here we go. Here in onCreate is where I'm attaching that read listener. The problem is the user isn't logged in yet here, because this is in onCreate, before the auth state listener is even made or attached. Our database rules say that you have to be authenticated to be able to read. So what's happening is it doesn't have the permission to successfully pull the messages from the database. So it'll actually only be effectual to attach this read listener when the user is actually signed in. So I'm going to go ahead and copy all of this code that creates and attaches the read listener, cut it, scroll down to the bottom, and move it down here. Now you're only setting the username and pulling the messages list when the user is actually logged in. Now onSignedOut cleanup is going to actually do the opposite to tear down the UI. It's going to unset the username, clear the messages list, and detach the listener. I'm actually going to go one step further and take this attaching read listener code and put it in a separate method. So here I've created a method attach database read listener, and I'll go ahead and call that instead. This allows me to have a single place to attach listeners, which can help keep things more organized. Now onSignedUp cleanup will do the opposite teardown to the UI. So instead of setting the username, it will unset the username, then clear the messages, and finally detach the listener. So the first of those three things is to take the username and to unset it by changing it back to anonymous. Next, I can take my adapter and clear the messages from it. And we're doing this because a user who is no longer signed in shouldn't be able to see those messages. Also, if you didn't clear the messages, you get a bug where you'd find duplicate messages when you're logging in and logging out multiple times. Similarly, I'm going to want to detach the read listeners here. And just like I created a attach database read listener method, I'm going to create a detach database read listener method. And I will define that method down here. And to remove the listener, I'm going to call remove event listener, passing in my child event listener. Now you can make this code more robust by enforcing that you only ever attach or detach a listener at one time. So in detach database listener, I'll write an if statement, making sure that child event listener is not null. And then after it's detached, I will set child event listener to null. I'll do a similar thing with the attach method. I'll add a check up here to see if child event listener is null. And only if it is null, meaning that it has been detached, will I create and attach the listener. Okay, and now one final step. The read listener is attached up here in the onSignedInInitialized method. OnSignedInitialized is called when authentication state changed is called. Auth state change is called when it is added to our Firebase auth object, which is a long way of saying if you resume the code and the user's logged in, a database listener will be attached. So we should also make sure to detach it in onPause. Okay, one more thing. Because we attach the auth state listener in onResume, which, if the user is logged in, will then trigger onSignInInitialize, which will then add a read listener, we should also be sure to detach the read listener here, as well as clear the adapter. These two lines of code also make sure that when the activity is destroyed, in a way that has nothing to do with signing out, such as an app rotation, that the listener is effectively cleaned up. Okay, you're done.